This is Ramzi Youssef. For a while, he was one of the most wanted men in the United States. His crimes included the involvement in the attack on the World Trade Center in New York in 1993, and the attempted assassination of the Pakistani Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto. Among his crimes was also the attack on Philippine Airlines Flight 434, the topic of this video. Philippine Airlines Flight 434 was an incident where an explosive device was planted on board a plane mid-flight, of which it later then severed many of the plane's flight controls. The pilots had minimal control of the plane. The blast had killed one person on board. However, the skill of the pilots had led the remaining passengers and crew to safety, saving the lives of 292 people. Philippine Airlines Flight 434 was merely a test run of the device that Ramzi Youssef had constructed. It had been made to be undetectable to airport security and screening, using many common household items. Youssef was to be involved in a much bigger plot which could have killed thousands in an attack on multiple airliners heading to the United States from Asia. Ramzi Youssef is currently being detained at the maximum security prison in Florence, Colorado. Born in Kuwait in 1968, Ramzi Youssef had been educated abroad in the United Kingdom, where he studied electrical engineering. Once he finished his education, he returned to Kuwait, to which he then left again for Afghanistan once war broke out in Kuwait in 1990. Once arriving in Afghanistan, Youssef made connections in the world of international terrorism. He received explosives training and was recruited for his skills and attention to detail. In 1992, Ramzi Youssef had travelled to the United States from Pakistan using a forged Iraqi passport. He declared political asylum to enter through New York's Kennedy Airport in the United States. 6 months later, he was involved in the bombing of the World Trade Center in New York in 1993. The bombing had killed 6 people and injured over 1,000. The day of that bombing, Youssef was already out of the United States. Youssef was then believed to have been approached by militants in Pakistan who gave him a contract to kill the Pakistani Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto. In his first attempt of the plot, his explosives had detonated prematurely and he was rushed to hospital. His second attempt at the assassination fell through as the sniper rifle that was supposed to be used hadn't shown up and the plot was called off. Youssef had then travelled to Thailand in spring 1994 before moving on to the Philippines to set up a bomb factory in a rented apartment. It is unclear on exactly when Youssef had arrived in the Philippines, having used multiple forged passports, but what is known is that on December 8, 1994, Youssef had rented an apartment in Manila, the Philippine capital. He hired a longtime friend of his, Abdul Hakim Murad, to assist in the construction of his bombs. From receiving access to the apartment on December 8th, it would only be 3 days before he would make his first attack. On December 11th, 1994, Ramzi Youssef would take a domestic Philippine Airlines flight from Manila to Cebu. After looking over flight schedules, the terrorists had determined that this plane would continue on to Tokyo after arriving in Cebu. The plan was to plant a bomb on the domestic leg, then Youssef would leave the plane and disappear from the airport terminal. To construct the bomb, Youssef had obtained a significant amount of the liquid explosive nitroglycerin, which itself was sourced in the Philippines. According to the confession from Abdul Hakim Murad following his arrest in 1995, Youssef had stabilized the explosive and concealed it inside a bottle of contact lens fluid. The other bomb components included 2 9-volt batteries, light bulb filament, miscellaneous electrical wiring, and a Casio-branded wristwatch. The exact Casio watch that was used as the bomb's timer was the F91W watch. This watch had first been introduced by Casio in 1989. It was very popular for its low price, durability, and long battery life. The watch is also notable for being consistently used in the world of terrorism. The watch itself has since stood the test of time and is still produced to this day. The bomb on Philippine Airlines Flight 434 was to be constructed on board the plane. Many of the bomb components would be placed into a toiletries bag as carry-on luggage. Some of the more suspicious components, such as the light bulb filament, would be concealed in the heel of Youssef's shoes. Ramzi Youssef in 1994 was now a skilled bomb maker and professional terrorist. For the day of December 11, 1994, to take the Philippine Airlines flight, he would use a forged Italian passport. As far as the airline and airport are concerned, Yusuf is actually an Italian national named Arnaldo Forlani. Interesting of note, this name is similar to the former Italian Prime Minister's name, Arnaldo Forlani. On the morning of December 11th, Yusuf arrives at Manila's Ninoy Aquino Airport early for his 5 a.m. flight to Cebu. He manages to smuggle all of his bomb components through airport security. At the time, many airport metal detectors could not scan below the ankle, so Yusuf's bomb was able to pass through. Flight 434 will be flown by a Boeing 747-200 aircraft, an older model of the plane. The plane had been delivered in 1979 to Scandinavian Airlines and had been transferred to multiple other carriers before ending up in the hands of Philippine Airlines in 1992. Piloting the plane today is a crew of 3. Captain Eduardo Reyes is a veteran pilot at Philippine Airlines at age 57. He has also served in the Philippine Air Force. His co-pilot is First Officer Jaime Herrera, while in the flight engineer's position is Dexter Comendador. Philippine Airlines Flight 434 left the gate in Manila and departed at a time of 5:35 in the morning on the first leg of the trip to Cebu. The domestic portion of the trip went on as routine. The plane headed south, the captain turned off the seatbelt sign as normal, and as so, Ramzi Yusuf sprang into action. He left his seat in row 26 and made his way to the lavatory where he would construct the bomb. Once complete, he conceals the constructed bomb inside his toiletries bag, to which he then returned to his seat. The seat he had chosen was 26K, a window seat on the right side of the fuselage. He then places the bomb inside the life jacket compartment under the seat, with the timer set to detonate the bomb at precisely 11:43, once the plane is expected to be long gone from Cebu and cruising over the Pacific Ocean. He then once again left the seat to sit elsewhere in the cabin. The flight is only of a light load on this leg of the trip, with only a few dozen passengers occupying seats scattered throughout the plane. Yusuf was served by cabin crew member Maria de la Cruz. She only works on domestic routes at Philippine Airlines, and had reported that Yusuf had moved multiple times throughout the flight. Flight 434 arrived in the Philippine city of Cebu at 6:50 a.m. Here Ramzi Yusuf left the plane, with the bomb left under the seat of 26K. Ramzi Yusuf then simply left the airport terminal and walked away. The airport at Cebu was busy that day as congestion on the apron had led to a 38-minute delay for the departure to Tokyo. A total of 273 people boarded the plane bound for Tokyo. Many of the passengers were Japanese tourists heading home. Philippine Airlines Flight 434 eventually left Cebu that morning and began flying north on its route out of the Philippines. The first 2 hours of the flight were routine as everything appeared normal. The man who had now occupied the seat of 26K was Haruki Ikegami. He was a sewing machine maker who had been on a business trip to the Philippines. It was his first trip abroad, and this was his returning flight home. At 11:43, the bomb under Haruki Ikegami's seat exploded, 4 hours after Ramzi Yusuf had planted it. Ikegami is fatally wounded in the explosion, which has also injured 10 others in the immediate area of the blast. Haruki Ikegami sadly dies just a few minutes later from his injuries. He was just 24 years old. The bomb had exploded in a vertical orientation, meaning damage to the plane occurred above and below the bomb. At this point, the crew of the plane do not know the extent of the damage, but the blast had blown a hole in the floor of the cabin and into the cargo hold below, as well as blasting through the ceiling of the cabin, damaging wiring relating to some of the plane's flight controls in the loft space above the cabin. There was no significant damage to the wall and skin of the plane despite the bomb going off in a window seat. Immediately following the explosion, the plane banked to the right. The autopilot had then quickly corrected this bank and straightened the plane into a level position. Captain Eduardo Reyes does not know the extent of the damage until flight steward on board Fernando Bayot reported to the captain via the intercom that an explosion had occurred in row 26, injuring multiple passengers with one known fatality. Row 26, on many variants of the Boeing 747, is located above the center fuel tank. However, on this day, Philippine Airlines had decided to book out a slightly different variant of the plane, which had a seating arrangement so that row 26 was equivalent to being 2 rows ahead than normal, avoiding the fuel tank in the explosion. It was uncertain whether the bomb could have ignited the fuel tank if the explosion had occurred there. However, the possibility of a catastrophic explosion was certainly there. Even though Haruki Ikegami had sadly passed away from his injuries from the explosion, the cabin crew had still attended to him with first aid and an oxygen supply as if he was just injured, to not distress other passengers. This is a psychological tool that some flight attendants are taught to do in order to not cause panic amongst other passengers, as the sight of a dead body can cause a great level of stress for the average member of the flying public. Captain Reyes had sent flight engineer Dexter Commendador to inspect the damage for himself, as he struggles to come to grips with the damage to the 747's flight controls. The crew had quickly determined that a bomb had exploded and made an attempt to report this to air traffic control. First Officer Jaime Herrera had made multiple attempts to contact the Japanese controller, who was having difficulties understanding the situation on board. Captain Eduardo Reyes then assumed radio communication and can eventually transmit a mayday message once another controller takes over. The crew of Flight 434 request emergency landing at Naha Airport on the Japanese island of Okinawa. The pilots had been coming to terms with just how damaged their plane actually is. They noticed that the autopilot, which had been keeping the plane stable and level, was not responding to changes of heading or altitude. The pilots needed to be able to turn their plane to have any hope of landing safely. There is the fear that if the autopilot is disconnected, the crew will lose what little control of the plane that they have. However, the need to be able to control the plane leads the crew to disconnecting the autopilot. As this is done, there is a sense of relief as the Boeing 747 remains stable. Although the plane is responding to some very light inputs, the primary flight controls are hopeless. At this moment, Captain Reyes opts for the use of differential power to turn the plane. By applying more thrust to one side of the plane and less to the opposite side, the pilots can slowly manipulate the plane's roll to bank the aircraft in the direction that they need. Using less overall power, they can also maintain some vertical control of the plane. Their plan was to start turning the plane to the right in order to eliminate smaller multiple turns, so they instead opted for one larger turn to line up for a heading to Naha. With guidance from air traffic control, Philippine Airlines Flight 434 had managed to land safely. The crew had successfully landed their stricken plane, saving the lives of 292 people. The aircraft immediately became an international crime scene under Japanese jurisdiction. The FBI was notified, as was Scotland Yard in the United Kingdom. Investigators working on the plane had stumbled upon their first clue as to the bomber being based out of the Philippines. Fragments of the 9-volt batteries that were used on the bomb bared a resemblance to a brand of batteries that were only sold in the Philippines. In the weeks that followed after the incident, there was no trace of Ramzi Youssef. During this time, he had been mass-producing his bomb with a higher concentration of the explosive used in Flight 434. Philippine Airlines was just a test run. He now turns his interest to his ultimate mission, the Bojinka plot. The Bojinka plot was to occur in 3 phases of attack. The first phase was the assassination of Pope John Paul II. The apartment which Ramzi Youssef had been renting in Manila had a clear view of the street. The Pope had been scheduled to travel down this street during an upcoming visit to the Philippines. The second phase was to plant bombs similar to the one that was used on Philippine Airlines Flight 434 on 11 airliners heading to the United States from all across Asia. The multitude of bombs being constructed in his apartment were to be used in this plot. The third phase of the Bojinka plot was to fly a plane into the CIA headquarters in Virginia. Overall, if the plot were to be successful, the attack could have killed thousands. The plot had been planned by Youssef himself, as well as Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who would then go on to be one of those who planned the 9/11 attacks in 2001. Bojinka was to be financed in part by a Saudi businessman who had marital connections to Osama bin Laden. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed had also been in the Philippines in 1994. On January 6, 1995, the Manila police received a lucky breakthrough as they were called to the Doña Josefa apartment block in Manila, where a small fire had been started, raising suspicion surrounding the occupants inside. Ramzi Youssef's partner in crime, Abdel Hakim Murad, had been mixing chemicals when smoke started spilling out of the apartment and into the hallways. Murad and Youssef had left the building, where police turned up shortly later. The police were interested in getting inside the apartment, where they discovered Ramzi Youssef's bomb factory, to which he turned his rented apartment into. Police discovered up to a dozen bombs, an abundance of the nitroglycerin liquid explosive, multiple forged passports, of which one had resembled another form of identification that was found in the aftermath of the World Trade Center bombing in New York, along with another which bared the same date of that bombing. Among the other finds in the apartment were several textbooks, documents, dictionaries, and chemical manuals which were all believed to have been notated and read by Youssef himself, as well as Ramzi Youssef's personal laptop. Yusuf had sent Abdul Hakim Murad back into the building to attempt to retrieve the laptop. However, Murad was immediately apprehended by police. A file on the laptop was later found which had laid out the Bojinka plot. This information was forwarded to the Federal Aviation Administration in the United States, which had then warned American air carriers. Another apartment in Manila had also been raided by police, which had connected Khalid Sheikh Mohammed to the Bojinka plot. Following his arrest, Murad had assumed the alias of Abdul Saeed and had offered a bribe of $2,000 to the police if they let him go. However, the Philippine police were having none of it. 67 days went past as Abdul Hakim Murad had not given any information. The Philippine police had resorted to what they had called tactical interrogation. Murad eventually confessed and was sent to the United States in April of 1995. Abdul Hakim Murad had given a testimony that would later be used to convict Ramzi Youssef. On May 16, 1998, Murad was sentenced to life in prison, where he is currently spending his days at Terre Haute Penitentiary in Indiana. As for Ramzi Youssef, he had escaped following the fire incident at his apartment in Manila. He had returned to Pakistan, where he stayed in a hotel in Islamabad, where he had also hired a new accomplice to aid in the construction of his bombs. The United States was keen on tracking him down and put a $2 million bounty on information that led to his whereabouts. A publicity campaign in Pakistan has spread his face all across the country. Youssef's new hire had come forward and tipped off the Pakistani authorities. He was later found on February 7, 1995. Youssef had been planning to move to the Pakistani city of Peshawar. However, he was caught shortly before he made his getaway. Inside his room, authorities had found Youssef had started constructing his bombs out of children's toys. Also located in his room were flight schedules and timetables for United and Delta Airlines. He was then flown out to the United States, where he spent some time in a federal prison in New York, where he stayed until his trial. Youssef was later sentenced to life in prison in solitary confinement on January 8, 1998. During his trial, he tried to justify his existence as a terrorist by referencing atrocities committed by the United States and for siding with Israel over Palestine, to which himself for the longest time had identified himself as Palestinian. He now spends his days at the maximum security prison in Florence, Colorado. The plane that was involved in the Philippine Airlines Flight 434 bombing was returned to service but was later sold by Philippine Airlines and was converted into a freighter. The plane now currently sits in storage at a regional airport in France. Captain Eduardo Reyes of Flight 434 had left Philippine Airlines to join Cebu Pacific Airlines, where he became a DC-9 captain and flight instructor. He sadly passed away from a fight with prostate cancer in 2007. First Officer Jaime Herrera went on to have a successful career at Philippine Airlines, having been promoted to captain, while Dexter Comendador, the flight engineer, had decided to also join Cebu Pacific. He later, however, joined the corporate world of the airline industry, where he became Chief Operations Officer for the Philippine branch of the low-cost airline Air Asia. He even served as CEO for a short time. There have been other major attempts to bomb passenger planes since Flight 434. In December 2001, British-born terrorist Richard Reed had attempted to bomb an American Airlines passenger plane en route to Miami. His goal was to detonate the plastic explosive which had been concealed in his footwear, similar to how Ramzi Youssef had also concealed bomb components in his shoes. In that incident, Richard Reed had failed to carry out his bombing and the plane landed safely in Boston, where Reed was arrested. He too is spending the rest of his life at the Florence Maximum Security Prison alongside Youssef. In August 2006, another major bomb plot had been foiled in the United Kingdom. Several passenger planes were targeted departing out of London's Heathrow Airport. Flights from United Airlines, American Airlines, and Air Canada had been targeted. This time the explosives were to be concealed within plastic soda bottles. Like in the case of Philippine Airlines Flight 434, these bombs were to be constructed on board the planes and blown up in flight. The announcement came on August 10, 2006 by the UK government. Heavy restrictions were put in place after the plot was foiled, to which some of these restrictions were relaxed. However, to this day, passengers in the United Kingdom cannot carry liquid containers exceeding 100 milligrams through airport security points. On Christmas Day 2009, another bomb plot had failed after a terrorist had concealed explosives sewn into their underwear. The chemical explosives failed to detonate, the plane landed safely in Detroit, and the bomber was apprehended by police. There has, however, been a successful bombing on board a plane in recent times which is of major significance. On October 31st, 2015, a Russian passenger plane, Metrojet Flight 9268, was blown up shortly after leaving the Egyptian resort town of Sharm el-Sheikh. The passengers consisted of Russian tourists returning home after a holiday on the Red Sea. The bombing killed all 224 people on board. This incident is still under criminal investigation in 2021. Hello everyone, thank you so much for making it to the end of this video. I know this has been the longest video on the channel so far, so I thank you very much for sticking with me to the end. This video has taken longer than expected to make with technical difficulties along the way. This was the video that was supposed to come out last weekend, but unfortunately the hard drive on my PC had been corrupted and I lost the whole video with around 80% of it completed or so. I was just about to finish it and then the whole thing was sadly lost, so it had to be redone and is here today. Anyway, things are back up and running as normal again, so I thank you for your continued support. I would like to thank my lovely patrons. If you would like to have your name featured or read out at the end of the next video, you can join my Patreon, link will be in the pinned comment. So a thank you to my £5 patrons, Aidan Montgomery, D. Rogers, KTP123, Ken Zachman, and Marie Innes. Thank you very much. And a special thanks to my £10 patrons, Cherub Cherub, Side Effect, and Will Tanner. Your support is greatly appreciated. Thank you so much. And that is it from me this week. Have a great weekend, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.